condition in the book, partly because I wanted the reader to be able to decide, what she really looked like. And how much of it was just in her mind, feeling self-conscious about how she looked, and how much of it was, really her skin. So the kids will see the picture. I'll show them a picture of somebody's hands that has the condition I imagine her having. And the kids at school tease her and call her camo face, because she looks like camouflage, and so that's part of her struggle, is that she goes to school and has to deal with these bullies. And Bailey doesn't seem to see that, right? He doesn't really make fun of her at all. In fact, he defends her when other people make fun of her. And there's a lot of things in this book that the characters hide, right? Like Z is kind of hiding from things, and Bailey kind of is hiding from things, you'll find out, and Ella herself, is self-conscious and has all these things. And basketball is one of those things that, because I'm tall, right, and maybe because I'm black, I don't know, and I'm from Indiana, right, everybody in Indiana is all about basketball. Like, you can't walk around this state and not like basketball, but I actually don't. And part of why I don't is that people always, when I was growing up, would assume that I play basketball, because I'm tall and I'm black, right? and so people would come up to me and they would say things like, "What position do you play?" And I'd be like, "What do you mean, what position?" "Basketball, what position do you play?" And I'm like, "I don't play." And there's this like, "What? You don't play?" This book is a lot about people looking at you and seeing something that isn't you, right? That's what she has to face, right? She faces, the bullies who see only what's on the surface and not what's underneath. And so she's trying to make friends like Z and like Bailey, who see her for what's underneath. And so there's a lot of little things like that sneak into the book. And so I talk to the kids about that. That to me is interesting, and hopefully to you. All right, so that was contemporary, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But I do want to read just one little other thing, actually two kind of shorter scenes than that, from The Rock and the River, which, as I was saying, is set in 1968 Chicago. And it's about a boy named Sam, who's 13 years old, and his father is a civil rights activist, close colleague of Dr. King, a fictional person, but in that kind of position. And so Sam has been part of the civil rights movement his whole life. He's gone to marches and demonstrations and made signs and everything. And in 1968, a lot is going on, and a lot of teens, including his older brother Stick, join the Black Panther Party because they're tired of marching, they're tired of protesting, and they want to take action in protecting their community in lots of different ways. And I'm happy to talk about the Panthers a little bit if people are interested in that. But I just want to read a short scene, which is the scene I read with the kids, and then another scene that kind of shows some of the turmoil that's happening in the community, and they're just 2 pages each, so it shouldn't take long. I'm trying to think if I need to preface this. Sam is 13, mom and dad, older brother Stick. The very beginning of the book, they're at a protest with their father, and they see some white men beating on protesters at the edge of the crowd. Sam and Stick go over, because Stick is at a point where he wants to defend people. He doesn't want to non-violently, peacefully protest. So Sam watches Stick defend the protesters against the white man who's beating them, and Stick gets hit in the head with a bottle and cuts his eye, so they go to the hospital. And while they're at the hospital, Sam visits the gift shop. And this is the scene that I use with the teens to talk about, to sort of showcase some of the issues that come up in the book. I walked past this is Sam, he's 13. I walked past the nurse's desk and down the long hallway. I strolled into the hospital gift shop. The man behind the cash register glanced up from his book and eyed me as I entered. I walked by a wall of get well cards and a bunch of little baskets with "It's a boy" and "Thinking of you" balloons tied to them. Then I squeezed the foot of a bear with a heart sewn into its chest. I stopped in front of a basket of fuzzy knit hats and mittens. The mittens made me think of Maxie Brown, the girl I might someday ask to be my girlfriend, if I could ever get her to say more than 5 words to me at a time. I thought of her standing in the schoolyard, her cold bare hands balled up in fists at the ends of her sleeves. The sign on the basket read, "Mittens $2.50, hats $4. I stuck my hand in my pocket. I had a couple dollars on me, but I wasn't sure it would be enough. "Put it back." The voice startled me, and I turned. The old man behind the counter glared at me. "What?" I said. "I said put it back." He moved out from behind the counter and approached me, shaking his fist. "Put what back?" "Don't give me sass, boy. You think I can't see?" He came up and grabbed my wrist, yanking my hand out of my pocket. $2 bills and some coins dropped onto the floor as he pried open my fingers. "I don't understand," I said. I glanced over his shoulder at the door. I didn't take anything. Turn out your pockets, both of them. I inverted the linings in my other pocket. The man frowned. All right, now get your sticky fingers out of my shop, you little... He called me a couple of names that would have had stick-tossing fists, or made Father turn cool and stoic as he walked away. Get out before I call the police. I stood there and took it. I stared at my $2 in change spread on the floor beside me, then at the purple mittens. Father would say, pick up your money, walk out right now. Don't give this man the satisfaction of humiliating you, and take your business elsewhere. Stick would say, if you want the mittens, don't let this racist jerk stop you from getting what you want. I bent over and gathered up the spilled cash. I took a deep breath as I straightened out. I want to buy those mittens, the purple pair, I pointed. The man stood there, sizing me up. I waited. I'd have to brush past him to get out of the shop, and I didn't want to get that close. The man picked up the purple mittens and pointed in the direction of the register. He made me walk in front of him until we got to the counter. He moved around behind it, keeping an eye on me all the while. He shoved the mittens into a small paper sack and placed it on the counter. $2.50, he said. I handed him my $2 and counted out 50 cents. He recounted it twice, then pointed to the door. Now get your thieving behind out of my shop and don't come back here. I reached for the bag and cleared my throat. Can I have the receipt? I said. No way I'd let him accuse me when I walked out. The man ripped the little piece of paper clear of the register without moving his eyes from me, and I watched him tuck it into the bag. I swallowed the automatic thank you that formed in my throat and left the shop without another word. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall until my heart stopped racing. I tried to breathe away the tightness in my stomach, but it was stuck there like someone's fist. I'd forgotten what happens when you go someplace new, how careful you had to be, why I wasn't allowed to go into the white neighborhoods without Father or Mama. I was still shaking a little as I made my way back to the waiting room. Okay. So that is the beginning of The Rock and the River, when Sam is beginning his struggle, right, of figuring out how he's going to approach things like this, right? This man is racist, this man is treating him badly, this isn't the first time it's happened, but it's the first time he's been alone when it's happened, because he always has to go places with his parents. And so he, in that moment, has to decide what he's going to do. And I'm so used to getting the kids to do this. Okay, so if you're listening well, does anybody know why I use that as an example of this book? Can anybody think of a reason why that scene might be a good example of the conflict that Sam experiences in the book? I'll give it to you if you don't want to. Okay. No, it's good. Well, usually I have it up on the screen so the kids can read along. In the moment when the man is being mean to him, what does Sam do? He thinks about what his father would do, and he thinks about what his brother would do. And in that moment, he has to decide, what am I going to do? Because I'm the one who's here. I'm the one who has to make the choice. And he, in this case, ends up choosing that he wants those mittens and he's going to get them. And ends up giving them to Maxie, who likes them, and they become a little bit more than friends at that point. So I like that scene because it shows a little bit of what Sam is going to go through the rest of the book. And the kids like that scene a lot for that. But their favorite thing about that scene is that he asks for the receipt. They're like, he's smart, he knows how not to get caught. But it shows what people had to think about, and what I think people today still think about. I mean, teenagers get followed around the store all the time. If I ask that question in an audience of kids of any race, who's been followed around the store, they raise their hand because people think that they might steal, right? Because they're teenagers and they can't be trusted. Anyway, something to think about. All right, so I have one more scene that's about that same length, short, but much later in the book. A lot happens, but you don't really need to know. That's why I chose this scene too. This was February, March 1968. It's now April 1968. And Sam and Maxie are, as I've said, now boyfriend and girlfriend, or as much as one can be boyfriend and girlfriend when one is 13. They have held hands, which is exciting. And every day he walks her home because that's the sweet boyfriend thing to do. And they are walking home today, and something strange is going to happen because it is April 4th, 1968. Maxie and I stayed late at school, watching some kids playing ball in the schoolyard. Finally, it's spring, Maxie cheered, spinning across the pavement. She danced, and I leaned against the fence. She'd retired the mittens until next winter, and her slender, graceful hands waved above her head. I laughed out loud at her crazy twirling. She was pretty much the only thing that made me smile these days. We stayed in the yard until Mr. Baker, the principal, emerged from the school. "All you kids, get home now," he called out across the yard as he locked the building. He shooed us out of the playground while we complained that it wasn't even late yet. I walked Maxie home, and when I left her, it was nearly dark. People seemed to be milling around more than usual, probably because of the good weather. I looked around. The crowds were growing. People streamed out of the buildings into the streets. "What's happening?" I asked someone rushing past. "King is dead," the man shouted, then ran on. "What?" I yelled after him. I spun around. "What's going on?" "He's dead." A woman's voice came from my left. She was slight, dark-skinned, and holding the hand of a little boy. "Who's dead?" "Dr. King. They shot him. Someone shot Dr. King." Her voice was clear. I caught every word this time, but it couldn't be true. "No," I said. The woman clapped a hand over her mouth. Tears came to her eyes. "Oh, Lord," she said through her fingers, "Lord in heaven." She scooped up the boy and hurried off through the crowd. As she left, individual shouts and people's crying separated from the general roar of the crowd. From a passing car radio, the news blared out and echoed between the sidewalks. Breaking news. Prominent civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. died tonight in Memphis after being shot while standing on the balcony of his hotel. Dr. King was taken. The voice faded and blurred into nothing. I stood senseless for a moment. Sure, I'd heard something wrong. Dr. King couldn't die. No one would let that happen. Just last night, we listened to part of his latest speech on the radio. He'd talked about the future. Said he'd seen the promised land and we were on our way. He'd been fine then, just last night. I couldn't believe it, and yet, somehow, I knew it was true. My mind cluttered with memories. Out of the gray dusk, they appeared. Dr. King's face, his voice, his presence. Dr. King, fist pounding the pulpit when he preached at our church once last year. Dr. King pacing in the hotel corridor, thinking about a big upcoming speech. Dr. King standing on the Lincoln Memorial steps on that same hot August day. Dr. King walking not 6 blocks from here, leading a rally for affordable housing. Dr. King at the dinner table, eating chicken pot pie from our good china plates. I bent in the middle, holding my stomach. I thought I might be sick. I searched the faces around me. There was an edginess to the crowd, as if we were all waiting for something to happen. It hung in the air, the promise of something horrible, as if the news wasn't horrible enough. When the restless energy in the street ignited, everything burst out in the open. Sadness and anger curled through the street, a wave of hurt. It tasted bitter. It looked ugly. Glass was breaking, raining down like tears against the asphalt. Things fell all around me, inside me, until it seemed there was nothing left. A shattered store window lay glistening at my feet. I stared at the wreckage. Feet and bodies rushed past, bumped against me. A scratching sound beside me. A boy striking a match. The tiny flame glowed as he lit the mouth of a Molotov cocktail. The flame seared the tip of the oiled cloth and sizzled toward the bottleneck. He hurled it, and the fire spread across the storefront in front of us. The boy spat into the pile of glass at our feet. He turned to me, a glistening light in his eyes. His gaze burned as hot as the fires around us, fueled by anger, helplessness, desperation. I saw my reflection in his eyes. If I stood still any longer, I might catch fire too. The shouts and pandemonium filled my head. Fire, crowds, broken things everywhere. Logic urged me to run, get away, but something kept me there. Another fire burned somewhere close by. The heat rose up and held me. It pressed close to me, pushed its way inside. I surrendered to the wave, to the fire. I picked up a brick from the sidewalk and flung it through the store window. Then I rushed at the building. The heat dug deep in my chest. It overpowered everything else, the confusion, the pain, the questions. I let the fire take over. I kicked the door until it caved in. I didn't know why. Because I was there. Because it felt less bad. Less bad than doing nothing. "Sam!" I turned. Maxie stood a few feet away. I dropped the pipe I held. It clattered to the street and rolled away. I rushed toward her but tripped and fell. Broken glass stabbed my fingers, tore the knees of my pants. I stood up and reached for Maxie. We raced through the streets hand in hand. Everything was on fire. The heat was all around me, in me. I wanted to curl up in the street and burn. I stumbled, but Maxie held me tight. Her face was streaked with tears and sweat. She pulled me into the alley behind George's liquor cabinet. We leaned against the rough bricks and breathed hard, staring at each other. Would tomorrow come? If it did, what would it look like? Maxie and I stood still and held each other. There was nothing else to do. She cried into my shoulder. I had to protect her, keep her safe from all the mess around us. Come on, I said, we're going home. I tucked her under my arm and guided her to the street. She wrapped her arms around my chest. A surge of feeling rushed through the empty space inside me. I kissed her moist cheek. She hugged me tighter. Police sirens and flashing lights surrounded us. The air smelled of sweat and ashes. It was hard to walk fast and stand so close, so I took her hand instead. We hurried on, fingers locked together, toward my house. That's it. So that one was a little more dramatic, sorry. But it was, you know, the wake of Dr. King's assassination. There were riots in many cities around the country, in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Chicago, which is where this book is set, but not in Oakland, because the Panthers actually walked around and tried to calm people down, which was interesting. But, you know, people were very frustrated and very angry, and, you know, in that moment in time, you know, for someone who was the model of peace, the model of nonviolence, the model of, you know, of we can overcome, literally, that was his, you know, his thing, to be killed in such a violent way was really the last straw for a lot of young people. And so a lot of the characters in this book, when that happens, just like a lot of people in real life, they're like, okay, we're done, we're not going to march anymore, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do this Panther thing, we're going to do other things like that. And it wasn't how we look at it now. It wasn't as simple as we look at it now. We want to say they were bad because they had guns, and, you know, that's always bad, which in a lot of ways it is, but you know, there was a lot behind what they were doing. There was, in fact, a 10-point program that the Panthers had. Actually, I think I have that marked. To read you the 10-point program, which basically concludes by saying we want land, bread, housing, clothing, education, justice, and peace for everyone, not just for black people, but primarily for black people in that moment because they were being denied it so systematically and so aggressively. And so, you know, it was really sort of a rallying moment for the Black Panthers, and they got a lot of young people involved in changing their communities in a lot of different ways. Political education, feeding people, opening health clinics, protecting people from police brutality, providing legal aid to people who didn't otherwise have it, and, you know, really getting people to sort of stop waiting for the law to change and to start sort of making their communities the way they thought that they should be. And so that's, you know, what these books are about. The second book, Fire in the Streets, is Maxie's story. She gets to tell her own story about being a young woman in the Black Panther Party, or a young woman who wants to be part of the Black Panther Party but is not quite old enough and not quite male enough for them to take her seriously at first. And so she tries to prove herself in that. So that's pretty much what I had planned to read for you. I do have time if people have questions or anything. Thoughts? Oh, yes.
How accurate did you try to be with the events and the dates and the things that happened?
I tried to be as accurate as possible. It's not perfectly accurate to the timeline. The Panthers were founded in 1966 in Oakland. This book is set between February and May of '68. The Panthers weren't really active in Chicago at that point quite yet, and they hadn't started their breakfast programs quite yet, but I wanted to show sort of that transition that happened with young people when King was assassinated. And I wanted to show like the breadth of what the Panthers were doing. So in the book, they're running a breakfast program, they're running political education classes, and they're opening a health clinic, or they're planning to open a health clinic, which they provided free universal health care for black people well, for anyone who came to their clinics in the poorest neighborhoods of like 40 cities around the country by the end of the time they were operating. And, you know, all privately funded donors and everything. And so I wanted to showcase some of that side of the Panthers in the book. Even though a lot of that didn't really start until 1969, because part of my purpose was to educate people about the Black Panthers and, you know, to say this is what they were doing, sort of as the entire movement. But Dr. King was really killed at that time, and all the things that the Panthers do in the book are things the Panthers really did, but some of it didn't start until a little bit later than the book.
So, what is your takeaway from writing about something that you want to learn more about? And, you know, the novels on, you know, the 60s and the turbulent times.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of sought that out and, you know, wrote about that. So what were some of your greatest insights or revelations to that particular period and, you know, what people were experiencing?
Yeah. Well, I think I kind of have two answers to that question. One is just to say that I think, you know, from my experience as a writer and the experience that I think some of my readers are having based on conversations that we have, I think it can be quite eye-opening to actually read a fictional piece about a real historical moment, not just the 60s, but other real historical moments, because I think fiction it really promotes empathy, and it's a way of feeling what someone else is feeling. And he's a fictional character, and, you know, the things he experiences are not, you know, exactly what really happened, but things like what happened to him really happened to people. And I think that for a kid to sort of dive into that and be able to see what someone was thinking and feeling when this type of thing happened, like, that is really eye-opening and can be sort of transforming to an individual to experience fiction in that way and to learn history through fiction in that way. So that's one. But as far as like what I've learned about the actual time period, my main takeaway from that has been that the history that I was taught, the black history that I was taught, was very simplistic. It was very simplified, and it was very narrow. And that is still the history that's being taught. And of course, you, to a certain extent, have no choice about that, because as time goes on, you can't teach everything. But we have, I think, not done as good a job as we could of integrating multicultural stories into American history, and to really understand, you know, what was happening between slavery and civil rights. There was a lot that went on to create the movement that happened with civil rights. It didn't start in 1955 or 1959, I guess, or 60 when Rosa Parks sat on the bus. You know, that's like sort of it looked at as like, oh hey, people got fed up and started fighting, and really they had been fighting all along. And there are lots of small stories, not even that small, but sort of smaller than the movement of civil rights as a whole, that that led up to that. That aren't talked about really at all. And so I think we do a disservice to young people when we don't try to tell a fuller story, when we try to boil everything down to, you know, kind of what's convenient and what's easy. And, you know, we can talk about sitting at the March on Washington, and that was a real watershed moment in a lot of ways. And of course it's a wonderful moment, but it like, that's sort of not, it's not really enough to explain what happened.
It's more sound bites.
It's more sound bites. That's a good way of putting it. And so for me, like, finding other moments in history that we can sort of draw out a little bit more is really helpful to understanding the full picture. Because, you know, kids really are taught that, you know, after the March on Washington in 1963, that wasn't even, I mean, that was long before King was even killed. That after that, we have peace now. And that was that moment, because everybody came together and stood up peacefully, and, you know, that was a successful moment. Like, after that moment, like, the laws changed and everybody was fine. Like, that's kind of how it's presented, in a way that's, to me, a little bit upsetting, because so much happened after that, and so much happened even in the 70s and 80s, you know, to get us to where we are today, which is to say we still have a lot of the same problems, and are dealing with them differently, and kids today are really disconnected from what that is, and how we got to where we are. So that's a long answer, but
No, I get it, you know. Great insights.
Thanks. I think I'm almost up. But okay, great. Well, thank you very much for listening. And thanks for coming.